Silas was not born a hero. He did not come into the world surrounded by glory or with angels announcing his name. He was an ordinary man, perhaps born in Jerusalem, perhaps in a nearby village, surrounded by Jewish traditions, synagogue prayers, and the smells of incense and warm bread. The Bible does not mention his date of birth, nor does it describe his childhood, but that does not matter as much as what he would become. Imagine Silas as a young man, hearing rumors on the streets about this man named Jesus, crucified as a criminal and then proclaimed alive by his followers. And then, casually, Silas approaches the movement. It is not known exactly when he decided to follow the risen Christ, but when he appears in the scriptures, he is already called a prophet, someone who speaks with authority, who delivers messages full of truth, like an arrow shot in the dark. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a financial donation by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. What is known is that when the church in Jerusalem needed to send someone trustworthy to deliver a delicate message to the Gentiles, Silas was chosen. It was no coincidence. He was respected, steadfast, someone who carried peace in his words and fire in his heart. He was not only the messenger of the Spirit, he was also the interpreter of hope. Antioch awaited him. The city was bustling, a melting pot of cultures and beliefs, and there was Silas arriving with a letter that could change the course of the Christian faith. He was the bridge between Jews and non-Jews, between the old and the new, between fear and freedom. It was there, amid the coming and going of voices and accents, that Silas would take the next step, because someone was waiting for him, and his name was Paul. Silas arrived in Antioch with his eyes alert and his heart beating faster than usual. The letter he carried was not just any piece of paper, it was a direct response from the council in Jerusalem, an attempt to calm tensions between Jewish Christians and Gentiles, who were growing in numbers without following all the old customs. It was like lighting a candle in the middle of a dry field. A spark could turn into chaos, but Silas, with his steady and calm manner, knew the right time to speak and the right time to listen. When he read the letter aloud to the church, you could feel the air changing. People breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, they would no longer have to carry the weight of the old law to get closer to God. And there, at that moment, Silas was not just a messenger. He was living hope, translated into flesh and blood. He stayed in Antioch for a while, helping, teaching, and strengthening the brothers with words full of life. He was like fresh water on a hot day. The people liked him, became attached to him, and learned from him. He and Judas, who came along on the mission, were like two pillars holding up the roof of a house under renovation. But then Judas returns to Jerusalem, mission accomplished, and Silas stays. Something inside him told him it wasn't time to leave yet. And it was during this wait that he saw a different man arrive, with a determined look and scars on his soul. Paul. They crossed paths like two lines on the same map, each with their own story but with a common destination. Barnabas and Paul argue, each goes his own way, and there is a space left on the team. The question hangs in the air, like a suspended beat before the chorus. Who will continue the journey with Paul now? Silas looks at the road, and it seems to call his name. That's how Silas joined Paul's missionary journey, almost as if he had walked into a conversation and already understood the mood. The argument between Paul and Barnabas had been ugly, and all because of John Mark, who had abandoned the previous trip. Paul didn't want to give him a second chance. Barnabas did. So they parted ways, each with his own conviction. And there, in that space left in the silence, Silas emerged as the natural choice. It was no coincidence. It was as if God had left that place reserved for him all along. Soon they were on the road. Dust rose at their feet, the heat beat down on their faces, and challenges came thick and fast. They passed through several cities, encouraging the brothers and confirming the churches that had already been planted. And at each stop, Silas gained more voice, more presence, more confidence. He was not Paul's shadow. He was his partner, shoulder to shoulder, sharing risks, sleepless nights, persecution, and also the discreet smiles of those who saw their lives being transformed. On one of these trips in Lystra, they met a young man named Timothy. He was shy, but his faith was rock solid. Paul saw potential in him and wanted to take him along. And so Silas went, now part of a trio that mixed generations, cultures, and experiences. They were like a three-strand rope, each strengthening the other. But then came the moment when their plans began to fall apart. They tried to go to Asia, but couldn't. They tried Bithynia, and nothing. It was as if all the doors were closed one after the other, like sharp blows to the face. Until, one night, Paul had a vision. A man from Macedonia was asking for help. "Come here." That was the sign. Without thinking twice, Silas packed his bag. Macedonia awaited them. What they didn't know was that, as they set foot in that place, they were about to enter one of the most remarkable moments of their entire journey. The crossing to Macedonia was quick, but full of expectation. It was as if each wave hit the boat with a question: "Are you ready?" Silas, quiet, watched everything. Paul, steadfast as always, only said that they had to obey the vision. And Timothy, still getting the hang of the mission, followed the rhythm of the two. They arrived in Philippi, a Roman city full of rules, pride, and people with their noses in the air. But it was also full of restless souls, needing something more. There was no synagogue there, so they went to look for a place of prayer outside the city, near a river. And it was there, in a simple setting with the sound of running water and leaves rustling in the wind, that they found a group of women gathered together. One of them, Lydia, was a seller of purple cloth, an influential woman. She listened attentively to everything Paul said, and Silas watched the sparkle in her eyes. There was no need to push anything. Lydia opened her heart, and her home as well. With this first conversion, the mission began to take shape. But the more it grew, the more heated the atmosphere became. One day, a young slave girl possessed by a spirit of divination began to follow the group, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God." It was true, but the way she said it every day sounded like mockery. Paul put up with it as long as he could. One day, he turned and cast the spirit out on the spot. Silence. Peace. But not everyone was happy. The young woman's owners, who profited from her divinations, were furious. Within hours, the entire city turned against them. They dragged them to the square, accused them of disturbing the peace, and without even the right to defend themselves, they were flogged and thrown into prison. Shackles on their feet, their backs marked, and the heavy air of injustice. Silas, there in the darkness of the cell, does not cry out or complain. He looks at Paul and knows what to do, because even in the densest darkness, there is always a song waiting to be sung. The prison was dark, cold, and smelled of mold. Chains bound Silas and Paul's feet, and each breath carried a little pain. The soldiers had been harsh, much more than necessary. The floor was hard as stone, but what weighed most heavily was the injustice. They had only freed a young woman. That was all, and now they were there, treated like criminals. But as night fell heavily over Philippi, something strange began to happen. Instead of complaints or whining, a melody came from the back of the cell, low at first, then louder. It was Silas, singing, yes, singing, a song of worship, the kind that breaks the silence and fills the air with something the walls cannot hold. Paul joined in, and soon the two of them were there, praising with everything they had, with their voices, with their sighs, even with their pain. The other prisoners stopped to listen. It made no sense. Who sings after being beaten and thrown in prison? Who turned shackles into instruments? But it was at that moment that the impossible decided to show up. A tremor shook the ground, strong, so strong that the prison doors opened and all the chains came loose. It was as if the earth itself had sung along. The jailer, seeing everything open, thought the prisoners had escaped. Desperate, he drew his sword to take his own life. But before the blade could touch his skin, Paul's voice echoed from the darkness. "Don't hurt yourself. We're all here." Silas stood still, watching that man, still trembling, fall to his knees. He wasn't the only one who was free now. That same night, something much greater than an earthquake happened inside that jailer. And as he wiped his eyes and asked to understand the way of salvation, Silas already knew. The next step was on the streets of Philippi, and the day had not yet dawned. The jailer, a man accustomed to shouting, chains, and harsh orders, now trembled before something he had never seen before: grace. With his hands still sweaty and his face marked by fear, he asked what no Roman would ever imagine saying, "What must I do to be saved?" It was as if that earthquake had opened more than just cells. It had broken down a wall inside. Silas replied with the same calmness he used to sing in prison, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved." It was that simple. No formulas, no rituals, just faith. And it wasn't just the jailer who believed. That same night he took Paul and Silas to his home, washed their wounds and put food on the table. His wife, his children, everyone listened and everyone believed. Suddenly the jailer became the host and the prisoners became guests of honor. The table was set. Warm bread, soft laughter, hands still trembling with emotion. It was hard to believe that just a few hours earlier they had been in chains. But that's how the kingdom of God moves, without asking permission, without following a script. It comes as a surprise, turns pain into celebration, and makes a prison cell a stage for miracles. In the morning, as if nothing had happened, the magistrates ordered the two to be released discreetly. They wanted to avoid confusion, but Paul, in his usual manner, would not let it go. "We are Roman citizens and were arrested without trial. Now you want to release us secretly?" Silas, standing beside him, knew that this was not stubbornness, it was justice. And when the officers heard that they had beaten Roman citizens without trial, they trembled with fear. They came personally to apologize and ask them to leave the city. But before leaving, Silas still wanted to see one thing: that fledgling church in Philippi, those transformed faces, especially those of the woman at the river and the jailer. But the road was calling again. And this time, the trail led straight to cities where the scriptures would be tested verse by verse. The dust from Philippi had barely settled when Silas and Paul were already on their way to Thessalonica. The sun beat down on their faces. The road seemed endless, but their eyes were fixed on the horizon. They knew what they were doing. Every step was a seed, every city a chance, and Thessalonica would be no different. When they arrived, as usual, they went straight to the synagogue. For 3 Saturdays in a row, Paul spoke, explained, quoted prophecies from the Old Testament, and connected everything to Jesus. Silas stood by his side, steadfast as always, reinforcing his words with the calmness of one who understands the weight of each word. And there were quite a few people listening. Several Jews, Greeks, and influential women began to believe. The flame was lit, but not everyone was happy. Some Jewish leaders became jealous. They began to stir up the city, dragging some brothers by force to the authorities, saying that these men were turning the world upside down. It was pure irony, but also a truth they couldn't swallow. The city became a melting pot. To avoid tragedy, the brothers hid Paul and Silas and sent them away at night, almost like fugitives. They arrived in Berea, tired but not defeated. And there, unlike in Thessalonica, the people listened with an open mind. They examined the scriptures every day to see if what they were hearing made sense. Silas saw a different sparkle in the eyes of those people, a thirst. It was like planting in soft soil, ready to sprout. But the peace was short-lived. The same agitators from Thessalonica heard that they were in Berea and went after them. they brought confusion again. Paul had to leave in a hurry, escorted to Athens. But Silas and Timothy stayed. They took care of the new community, strengthened the brothers, and only then went to meet Paul again, in another city full of statues, speeches, and unknown gods. Corinth was noisy, a mixture of voices, smells, merchandise, and sins on the surface. It was the kind of city that gave you a headache just arriving. But Paul, Silas, and Timothy weren't there for sightseeing. They knew that where chaos reigns, grace cries out louder. When they met again there, Silas and Timothy brought fresh news from the church in Thessalonica, people steadfast in their faith despite persecution. It was a great relief to Paul, who had been feeling a little down. With this renewed joy, they threw themselves into their work in Corinth, and there Silas became more than just a helper. He was an advisor, a support, a friend who holds your arm when your legs want to give way. They stayed at the home of Aquila and Priscilla, a couple who made tents. And since Paul also worked with tents, it was a way to support the mission. Silas helped as he could, with his hands and with his words. And at night, in synagogues or homes, they preached. Sometimes people listened with interest, other times with anger, but there was always someone who stopped, thought about it, and decided to change. Little by little, a group began to form. Simple people, complicated people, rich people, poor people, all together. Silas saw a living community being born where before there had only been strife. It was like seeing a garden sprout up in the middle of the asphalt. People arrived with empty eyes and left filled with something they couldn't explain. One day the Lord himself appeared to Paul in a vision and told him not to be afraid, that there were many people in that city. Silas, upon hearing this, understood. They still had much to do there. So they stayed in Corinth for over a year, and it was during this time that letters began to be written. Silas helped. He gave advice, corrected, and followed each line. But the road, that old acquaintance, would soon call them back, and the next destination would come with the scent of the past and the weight of responsibility. When they finally left Corinth behind, Silas was no longer the same man who had left Jerusalem some time before. The marks on his soul were deep, some made by fatigue, others by love for the lives that had been transformed. Their next destination took them back to Jerusalem, the place where it had all begun, where the streets still held memories of the cross and Pentecost. Silas returned, carrying much more than luggage. He brought testimonies, living stories, names, faces, entire churches that had been born on foreign soil. There, among the apostles and elders, he shared everything he had seen. He told of Lydia by the river, of the jailer who washed his wounds, of the brothers in Thessalonica, of the studious Bereans, and of the noisy church in Corinth that now praised in one voice. Each story was a piece of the kingdom growing, like invisible bricks in a temple built with faith. But even with his feet back on home soil, Silas did not stop. He continued to help with church decisions, visiting brothers, strengthening those who were weak. He also played an important role in the writing of letters. Paul still dictated, of course, but Silas gave his opinion, made suggestions, and clarified the text. Like a dance between ideas, he helped the words find their place. In Thessalonians, for example, his name appears right at the beginning. It was recognition, but not vanity. It was partnership. Over time, the trips became less frequent. Silas stayed more in Jerusalem and later in places not far away. But he still went here and there, bringing news, encouraging leaders, caring for the people like someone watering a mature plant. Not in a hurry, but with love. And even with a slower body, his voice remained firm, still able to ignite enthusiasm in downcast hearts. After years of walking side by side with Paul, spreading the word and strengthening churches, Silas became an almost invisible but indispensable figure. He was not a leader who sought the spotlight. His mission was to serve, support, and carry faith in his heart. Many do not know exactly where his journey ended. The Bible does not record his last breath, his last step. But that does not diminish the weight of who he was. Silas became synonymous with loyalty and courage. He stood firm even when the winds blew against him, when prisons tightened their grip and voices whispered doubts. He was the kind of man who held onto the rope when everyone else wanted to let go, who spoke the right words when fear wanted to silence everyone. His life is like a living metaphor. He was not the lightning that lit up the sky, but the embers that never go out. Some say that Silas continued to preach in lesser-known places, far from the big cities, among small communities that needed strength and hope. Others believe that he may have died peacefully, without fanfare, but leaving a legacy that even history could not erase. And yet his name appears with honor in the letters of the New Testament, remembered as a faithful companion, battle partner, and brother in faith. Silas challenges us to this day to be courageous in silence, to understand that not every story needs applause to be great, that the real impact lies in persevering, even when no one is watching, and in believing, even when all seems lost. And it is precisely this long and winding road, full of encounters, imprisonments, songs, and miracles, that leads us to think, if Silas's faith was able to move mountains and free hearts, what is the call that is waiting for us now? Silas may not have had his name stamped on great monuments or stories told around the campfire, but the impact of his life reverberates to this day, right in front of us. His story is not about glitz or the spotlight. It is about presence, resilience, and unwavering faith. He was the kind of person who walked alongside others, even when the road was rocky and the sky seemed too heavy to bear. What we can learn from Silas is that not every calling has to be grand to be powerful. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply to keep going, to keep believing, even when everything around you seems to be conspiring against you. To keep singing in the middle of prison, continuing to bring hope when no one else wants to listen. Silas reminds us that true strength isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. And there's more. He shows us that being a companion is a divine mission. His journey with Paul is proof that no one wins alone, that the weight of difficulties is shared, voices are amplified, and faith multiplies when we walk side by side. Being a partner in struggle, in preaching and encouragement, that is the flame that has ignited many churches, many lives, many hearts. In the end, Silas leaves a question hanging in the air, echoing to those who hear his story today. What is our calling? How much courage are we willing to show when the going gets tough? Because just like him, we all have a path to follow. And sometimes the simple act of being present is the miracle the world needs. Silas' life is an invitation to not give up, to not wait for recognition, to be faithful, even when no one is watching. It is living proof that on the stage of faith, the backstage is just as important as the spotlight. And it is precisely in that silence that God writes his greatest stories. If you enjoyed Silas's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming adversity, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.